We're pleased to have Steve Gardner here, who's been a long-time fantasy sports pioneer way back in the 1990s and maybe even before. Very interesting career he's had and youth he's had. So let's get started. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing great. Getting ready for another baseball season. So always fun to look forward to that.
Yeah, it's a 2020, kind of an interesting, symbol, 2020, hindsight, etc. I'm not sure if that'll do anything, but great.
We could only draft using it, right?
Yeah, if there was some wizard that helped us there. Predicting the future, that's what we have to try and do every year. Mm-hmm. So tell us about your youth. I'm looking at your crib sheet here, or crib sheet. Talk to us about how y'all got started when you were young, or your thoughts when you were young.
Well, I don't know how far you want to go back, but when I was a small child, the one thing that I wanted to do as a career was be a radio play-by-play announcer. And that stuck with me from a very young age. I loved listening to games on the radio, and had some great broadcasters that I grew up listening to. You hear all the stories about tuning in your radio to hear the faraway baseball games and things like that. I was that kid. And so I listened to the greats, Chuck Thompson of the Baltimore Orioles, who actually I have a bobblehead of back up there on my shelf, was one of the first great baseball announcers that I remember listening to. And that was just something I thought was fantastic. You get to go to the games and talk about it. It was fantastic. I thought that was the life for me. And so I was always a kid who liked to imitate people and everything. So it just seemed kind of logical that doing something on the radio would be a great job for me once I grew up. And I kept following that. And I think that's what's kind of interesting is that, a lot of kids want to be an astronaut or a pro football player or something like that when they grew up. I started out wanting to be a radio play-by-play guy, and it sort of channeled me all the way into the career that I have right now. That's
fantastic. Now, you started actually getting into radio in high school, was it?
I did. It was funny because I was pursuing the broadcasting we had like a radio club in high school. And I got the idea, actually with a little spurring from my parents, to ask one of the sportscasters in the city where I grew up, Charlottesville, Virginia, to ask the University of Virginia radio play-by-play guy, whose name was Mac McDonald, do you think that this camp that was in North Carolina would be a beneficial thing for me to do over the summer? This was probably in between my sophomore year in high school. And he said, well, yeah, sort of, but I think you'd learn more if you just interned under me. And so I was like, I'll do that. That'd be great. Wow. And so I went to the radio station, watched what he did. He gave me an opportunity to actually be on the air and fill in with his afternoon sportscasts and morning sportscasts when he was on vacation over that summer, which I thought was pretty amazing for a high school kid. And actually produced a little high school football show that ran on Saturday mornings. So that's kind of how I got my toe into it. And again, fell in love with it, loved everything about it. And that's kind of where I got started and majored in that in college. That sort of thing. Did some radio play-by-play for some high school football and college women's basketball. So enjoyed the heck out of that. And it's something that, I love talking about sports. And I think that's something I will always love doing.
That's fantastic. Now, when you were in high school, what year was this roughly? I just kind of want to get a perception of that.
Okay. I graduated high school in 1982. So this was probably around 1980. One of the things that I remember when I was working at that radio station, that was the year that, remember, the Rochester Red Wings and Pawtucket Red Sox had like a 23-inning game. I remember that I was reporting on that. That was one of the things. I don't know why that sticks out in my memory, but it did. That was one of the things back then. So it was a little while ago, I think you could say.
So you majored in communication at James Madison University.
Right, Harrisonburg, Virginia.
And so during this all time, and the early 80s, you got your start. When did fantasy sports, whether it's football or baseball, start to become in your mind?
It's interesting. I kind of missed out at the beginning of fantasy sports and fantasy baseball. The first thing I remember, and it was out after I'd gotten out of college, did not have any fantasy leagues in college, which is a tremendous place to learn to play the game and find lots of people willing to participate. I remember the first job I had out of college, I was working at a radio station back in my hometown of Charlottesville, and one of the sales guys came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm playing this thing called fantasy baseball, and here are the rules, and I've got like the first pick in the draft coming up, and what do you think? Who should be the number one pick should I take?" And I'm like, "Oh, wow, that sounds so cool." And so I started thinking about all of that and the stats and all, which I was a stats geek through and through growing up, so that was right up my alley. And I was like, you know what? I think the best player is Barry Larkin. I think you should take Barry Larkin. So that's kind of like the first time, probably, 1987, somewhere in there, that I first started hearing about fantasy baseball. And so that was the introduction to it. But I never started playing until it was probably 10 years later when I latched on at usatoday.com, and a bunch of people in the office were talking about, hey, let's start up this fantasy league. So I jumped in AL only fantasy baseball. And after that, we had a fantasy football league the following year. And then I was really hooked.
Yes. Now, let's see. It says here you were started at USA Today for breaking at news by phone.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Well, what that was, I was working in radio. I was doing news and sports at various different stations. Even had a time where I was a country music DJ, if you can believe that. But I moved. I got my big break. One of the people that I used to work with at one of the radio stations was working at USA Today, and they had a news by phone service, which is basically, in the infancy of portable phones, mobile phones, cell phones, you could call this 800 number or 900 number, I guess it was. And, would you like to hear news? Press 1, or sports, press 2, that sort of thing. And we actually recorded a bunch of little audio files, and we updated it constantly so that people could, come in and get scores. That was really popular because they weren't that easy to get back then. This was in 1993. Is when I first started. And so we were kind of like a mobile news service that you could call in and get scores and stories and things like that, breaking news, which was kind of revolutionary at the time. But as things changed, as they do quickly in the world of electronic media, it didn't last very long, maybe only a couple of years. Fortunately, that's when the internet started becoming more popular, and USA Today started up a website. So I was able to go from that news by phone service to usatoday.com.
That's fantastic. So when you got to usatoday.com, how did your job change, or how did that evolve?
I got it. There weren't any openings in the sports department, so I got into the news department. Had a little bit of that news background, so I worked with them on that side. And then when a spot opened up, interestingly enough, where I got my break there at usatoday.com, the baseball strike had happened in 1994, and baseball's popularity had really sunk, in the public eye. And just before the McGuire-Sosa home run, battle kind of boosted baseball back into the public spotlight, nobody at work really wanted to do baseball. And that was the way that I got from the news department into the sports department. I said, well, I'll take care of, I'll be the baseball guy. And so that's where I got pulled into it. And then with McGuire and Sosa, obviously baseball then sort of recaptured the imagination of the American public then. And I found myself in a really good spot because I loved baseball growing up. I think football was probably my favorite sport, but still I was a huge baseball fan from way back. So that was perfect for me.
Wow, that's interesting that they lost that much faith in baseball because of the strike.
It was weird, and I think get into a time capsule and go back. I mean, to cancel a postseason and not have a World Series, that sort of thing. It really took a lot of people, a lot of their interest out of the game, and it took a while for it to come back.
Because there was a point where obviously fantasy baseball was number one, and then the evolution of fantasy football becoming number one. Maybe it was around that time frame. I don't remember. Do you remember?
It was probably a little after that, to tell you the truth, because fantasy football, I remember fantasy football was, kind of an afterthought when it was, fantasy baseball was the thing. And you started having people like Ron Chandler with the baseball forecaster and all that sort of stuff. People had an actual, there was skill and things like that was brought into fantasy baseball. And I don't think that until a few years after that did people start really playing fantasy football, full bore, and it became the monster that it is today. Fantasy baseball was number one, into the 90s and, close to the 2000s, the early 2000s. It was still fantasy baseball 1 and fantasy football 2. Yeah,
I can't remember when they flipped, but I think, getting off on a quick sidebar, I apologize.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe what happened with football is it's easier to play. It's once a week.
Oh,
yeah. You can go to work on Monday, Tuesday, and Friday you go, I got to start thinking about my lineup. Where baseball, it's every day. You got to be there, and of course it's 6 months long, etc. Maybe that had a little bit to do with it also. And another sidebar, I apologize, is it's what is today, the 25th of February 2020. Mm-hmm. Next year is the end of the collective bargaining agreement with the NFL and the NFL Players Association. And 10 years ago or 9 years ago, I think that football was hurt by the strike or however long it lasted. I wonder if they're smart, if the collective of them is smart enough to make sure that doesn't happen again. What do you think?
Fantasy, I think, has changed pro sports, over the last 10, 15 years to such a huge degree. I mean, for so long, they wanted to keep, the pro sports leagues wanted to keep their distance from fantasy. And I know at USA Today, we had a publication, Baseball Weekly, sprung up because there were people who wanted the stats and wanted to play fantasy baseball, but you didn't say fantasy. That was the one thing. You had to kind of couch it as, here are the rookies to watch as opposed to fantasy baseball prospects. If you said fantasy, you turned a lot of people off immediately. And now it's just so ingrained into, the overall fabric of pro sports. It's kind of weird to think back on, how the fantasy community was this little subset over here. And you didn't want to associate with them because they're fantasy people.
Now, when was this, the weekly show? Do you remember the time frames that you were doing that?
Oh, Baseball Weekly was publication that began shortly after USA Today was founded. I mean, maybe 10 years after USA Today was founded. So that was something where that's really how I got into fantasy sports, to tell you the truth, is that John Hunt, legendary fantasy baseball columnist, wrote for many years, founded the League of Alternative Baseball Reality, LABR, that's still going on today, was the fantasy columnist and just had this tremendous influence in the fantasy community because he was the only kind of national guy that wrote about it and embraced it. And so when he finally left USA Today and Baseball Weekly, now Sports Weekly, they said, hey, we need somebody to write about fantasy baseball, and came to me and said, well, you're running the baseball stuff on the website, usatoday.com. Why don't you just write write a column a week for Sports Weekly? And so I was like, well, you can't say no sometimes. It's one of those opportunities where you don't really have a choice. So I was like, well, I like fantasy baseball. Sure. I'll do the best I can. I'll do it for a while. And then we'll get somebody in here who really knows what they're talking about and they'll hire them full time. And I can go back to doing whatever I was doing. And that was 2006.
Wow.
So this 15 years, I've been writing that same fantasy baseball column. And I took over when John left, took over as the commissioner of the labor leagues.
Oh,
so
okay, cool.
Running those since then as well.
Now, it says here you wrote a fantasy blog, Fantasy Windup, 09 to 12.
Yeah, that was, there was a time in the internet has changed so much and so many different times. There was a wave of people starting up blogs, and at usatoday.com, we were, we need a blog on entertainment, and we need a blog on this, and we need a blog on that. And so one of the things that ideas that just popped up was, well, hey, why don't I write a blog about fantasy baseball? I mean, there are a lot of people that are interested in it, and there weren't a whole lot of people writing about fantasy baseball, certainly full time. A lot of people were doing it, as a side thing and writing their own personal blogs. But to have the audience built in with usatoday.com, and to be able to introduce that and say, hey, we're writing about fantasy baseball, it was kind of a turning point for me professionally, because to that point, I had been the online baseball editor for usatoday.com. So I was running the site and making sure, changing the baseball page and all that sort of stuff, while also writing fantasy and doing that at the same time. And they basically said, okay, you've got to choose now. You've got to do one or the other. We can't have you doing both. So the question was, do I continue to cover baseball? And I covered World Series from 2000 up until then. So it had been 9 years, me covering baseball and all that sort of stuff. And another, 3 or 4 years writing fantasy for Sports Weekly. It said, okay, you got to choose. You can't do both. So I said, well, I think I've built up enough credibility to where I'm somebody, at least a voice that people recognize in fantasy, and I'm one of thousands of people covering baseball, so I'll do the fantasy thing. So they said, okay, great. Here's a fantasy blog. Write your own blog. And I found out the hard way how much work it is to keep up a blog. And when you're essentially the only writer and people want you to write something new, several times a day, 7 days a week. And that was a real eye opener. But it forced me to think about what's important, what do people want to know, to be in touch with people who are reading, interact with people in the comments and that sort of thing. So it was a really good experience. It lasted for a couple of years, and then things changed again, and we decided to move in a different direction.
So 2012, you became the USA Today Senior Fantasy Editor. Is that correct?
Yes. What happened there, again, changes in the industry. USA Today had a sports media group. We decided that we were going to buy other properties and get bigger as an entity. One of the companies that we bought was included a group of sports and fantasy related websites. One of those being KFFL.com. For those folks who've been around fantasy sports for a long time, will recognize that name. Ryan Benini, Corey Benini, Tim Heaney, Nick Minix, guys like that, Keith Hernandez, were suddenly all of a sudden part of the USA Today team. And we decided to push in on fantasy and make it an even bigger thing. We had more people to write. We had a bigger site and everything. We even tried for a little while our own daily fantasy game a little bit down the road, which couldn't compete with the DraftKings and the FanDuels. And so we ended that after a little while. But with all of these resources, then we began to pour into fantasy. We put out publications, magazines, fantasy baseball and football magazines that won several FSTA, FSWA awards, and just had a fantastic staff and resources like you wouldn't believe. And then, then things changed again. And all of a sudden they were gone, and I wasn't doing fantasy full time anymore. I was doing other things, back into fantasy and baseball and other sports and things like that. So while I still have that senior fantasy editor title, I basically use that during draft season for football and baseball, when we put together a big preseason publication, which we still do for Sports Weekly. But other than that, I'm a lot like a lot of people out there. I'm doing my regular job during the day, and I'm doing fantasy stuff and writing and all of that kind of on the side, and a lot of it on my own time.
Yes. Now, the magazine, the fantasy magazine, it says it was 2015 to 17. Did you guys stop doing that?
Yep. Essentially, it was one of those cost benefit things. It was not for the quality of the magazine. I thought it was an outstanding magazine, and we won, like I said, those awards.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Many of those years that we did put the magazine out, it was beautiful. It had the graphics like you'd expect for USA Today. We had top-notch contributors from all across the industry, writing, design, editing. They were things. One of the things I'm most proud of, to tell you the truth, in my entire career is when those things came out, and you could look at them and say, "Wow, we did all of this." We got started in November, and it comes out in January, February. That I think is one of the things that I really still think about with the print industry, to be able to, it maybe declining in many aspects, but to be able to have something like that and hold it in your hand and say, "Wow, we did this," it's pretty neat.
And it's more physical. So you obviously did a baseball fantasy. Did you ever do any football fantasies?
Yep, we did the magazines for football as well, and I've written fantasy football. Obviously, as we've talked about here, fantasy football in terms of popularity has skyrocketed past baseball. So when it comes time, you've got to respond to your audience, and there were more people clicking on the fantasy football things on our website and buying publications that were fantasy football related. So yeah, I mean, I had to get into that. I didn't do my own rankings because we had other people within our network who did a much better job of that. But in terms of in-season management, I'd still write columns. I'd still write waiver wire pieces, things like that. So still plenty of fantasy football stuff there. I love fantasy football too.
Well, actually, in 2014, you won the Fantasy Pros most accurate rankings for baseball, according to this piece of paper.
Yes, that is true. And I always, that's one thing I do definitely do is I'm up the ranking source for anything, USA Today when it comes to baseball. So I've been doing that for a while. And when Fantasy Pros, opened up that competition, you put your final season rankings into their little engine, and they crank it out. I've been kind of fortunate, to tell you the truth. Getting that number one ranking was pretty amazing, and I've gotten in the top 10 a few other years too. Yeah,
that's really an incredible task, because there's a lot of people in those contests, and just getting in the top 10 is an incredible task. We at Fantasy Nation also have one for football. We started last year and continuing on in 2020, and it's not easy. It's not easy to win those things. Well, you got to
continually update them too. I mean, every little thing people want to know, and it helps you to be able to stay on top of things.
Yeah, the weekly Sunday morning, stuff happens the last 90 minutes, and you got to adjust to those things to be able to compete with accuracy. Right. And of course, your customers wants those things also. Well, these are some fantastic accomplishments that you've had. You're truly a fantasy sports pioneer, and it's been great to have you on.
Well, thanks so much. And I'll tell you what, Emil, I remember the first time I went to an FSTA conference was one where you were inducted into the Fantasy Sports Writers Hall of Fantasy Trade Association, one of those Hall of Fame. So I feel a real honor to be able to talk to you today, because you were one of those people that when I was a newbie in this industry, like, oh, wow, listen to all those accomplishments that guy's had. It's amazing.
I don't remember what accomplishment. We did start our magazine in 1990. We got a relatively early start. There were a few people around. There's a lot of stuff that happened in the 80s. There were books that people put out about fantasy sports, and there were contests in newspapers. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the 80s. And also, Bob Harris and I, did an article back in 2003, I think it was, about the beginnings, the origin of fantasy sports, and we found out things that Bill Winkenbach started fantasy golf and fantasy baseball in the late 1950s.
Uh-huh.
There's the Superior Tile Summer Invitational Home Run Tournament, which is a baseball contest. It started around 59 or 60. I've got a letter from Bill Winkenbach, the commissioner of both that and the Goppel. It was like 1966. So, man, it's been around a while. It's of course, rotisserie started about 2 decades later, around 1970 and 1980, which basically took fantasy baseball and made a specialized rotisserie about it. And they wrote a book and made it very popular. So it's interesting how long we've been in this evolution of fantasy sports since the 50s.
Yeah, it is. And to think, can you imagine what those founders think of what it's become now, to where you've got fantasy programs on TV, and fantasy stats scrolling at the bottom of your NFL games. Pretty amazing how far. You talked about how the major leagues were concerned about it. We got started in 1990, we meaning myself and the magazines and Fantasy Football Pro Forecast, etc. And I remember, calling up the PR groups and they just like, get out of here, we don't want to talk to you. Especially said, how's this guy doing? Is he hurting? I was like, get off the phone. And they hated fantasy. They were scared of it because of gambling. But it was interesting once we got around 2000 or so. The problem, be careful what I say, but I think a lot of things about marketing in like the NFL, people are going to, when they turn the TV on Sunday morning, what are they going to do? They're going to watch the NFL. So they were a dominant thing, and they were, they didn't have to necessarily listen to their audience, if I may be so bold. So they just were scared and thought it was stupid, and it was just annoying to them. But then at one point, I think they finally realized, wait a minute here. People keep talking and asking questions, and I think reality is that a significant amount of the NFL's growth in 2000 to 2010, 20, whatever, well, as you said earlier, was fantasy sports, fantasy football. But then they tried to take it over and try and say they owned the stats, and now we've got the NFL Network, and it's 50-50 fantasy football. Yeah, I think that was a huge watermark, or turning point in fantasy sports when Charlie Wiegert and the folks at Fanball sued Major League Baseball for the ability to use the stats as public information without, they didn't want to have to pay that licensing fee and all that sort of stuff, or baseball was going to charge this huge licensing fee. And they went to court and won. Yeah, that changed the game completely. And I think a lot of times, because it happened a while ago, we kind of forget about that. But if Charlie doesn't win that lawsuit against Major League Baseball and the Players Association, fantasy sports could have been shut down. Fantasy sports as we know it. So
as we know it, because what they wanted to do, the NFL wanted to do, was they just wanted to give a couple, 3 companies the ability to do it and get rid of everybody else. They wanted to monopolize it like they've monopolized everything else. One of the things that we probably ought to go into that in one of these histories is, but just as a reminder here, is there was a lawsuit with the NBA, and I forget who it was before that. And the NBA lost, and basically it was about a cell phone doing play-by-play on games live, real time essentially. And the lawsuit was, if I remember it correctly, is the cell phone, etc., won the lawsuit because, in their opinion, stats is the moment a play is done, it's a historical record. And historical records are public domain. So not only they were able to do the game on their phone, they could do they could do real time essentially, because once the play was done, they could talk about the play, quote, real time. And I think that actually was before the issue with the fantasy and with Charlie Wiegert, et cetera. So that actually helped a lot in making, getting that victory. But definitely the NFL and the Major League Baseball wanted to take over fantasy sports. And for you and I, that's a good thing they lost.
That's exactly right. We may not be here having this conversation had that not happened.
And it makes sense, too. And it was a little disappointing in my naive perspective why would the NFL do this? Why aren't they buddies with us? We helped them grow all these time, but that's just not the way business works, I guess, in some cases, especially with these big companies like the NFL. Not to be mean.
Well, this is a pretty good history 101 of fantasy. You know.
Yes, it's been fun.
We talked a lot about this stuff.
Anything we missed you want to bring up?
No. Just I'm continuing to keep pushing on and looking forward to another season. Getting to get ready to go down to spring training and cover cover some real baseball and draft some fantasy baseball teams. LABR draft coming up over the weekend. So once again, we get the season started and crank it up one more time.
Now the LABR, is it going to be an auction or a serpentine?
Yes, we did have a mixed draft, which we did online for our special USA Today fantasy preview that we put out. But these three, we have the NL draft, or the NL auction is first coming up on Friday night, AL auction on Saturday, and both of those, I think this is the 27th year now for AL and NL LABR. And then we added a mixed auction on Sunday as all part of the Baseball HQ First Pitch Florida Conference. So we're actually, for the first time ever, going to be able to have a studio audience to watch the LABR drafts as they take place. That's
going to be a blast. Now, is the reason they went to AL or NFL, AL or NL because there were too many players? Is there a reason way back when we started to break those up?
I think that's just the way that fantasy leagues started, that you wanted to restrict the pool. And obviously there was a lot bigger separation between the American League and the rules that they played and the National League. And you had no interleague play. So they were basically, you could have two games going on at once.
Oh, okay. I didn't think about that. Well, Steve, thanks for being a fantasy sports pioneer. You've had an incredible career.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think of myself as much as a pioneer as a caretaker of the industry, but I certainly appreciate being lumped in with some of the great guests that you've had already.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I've got a lot more to go, and I really appreciate you taking your time, and congratulations, and good luck in the drafts, and have fun at spring training.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
Thank you, sir.